Hello everyone, welcome to week 3 of Globalisation since 1945, our week on activism this week. I'm on campus and in my office. Seminar is going to begin soon. I'm looking forward to our discussion of Annette Joseph-Gabriel's Reimagining Liberation, How Black Women Transformed Citizenship in the French Empire, and Priyamvada Gopal's Insurgent Empire, Anticolonial Resistance and British Dissent. There's so much to say about each of these books, two important, insightful works that I'm anxious to see what people have to say about them. And then after that, of course, I will pick up with some after-seminar remarks, try to say a bit more about, the arguments of each of the books, and a little bit about the historiographical context, and maybe a little bit more about activism as a larger topic as well. Let's take a look out the window here. It's not raining. This is good news. Hopefully it will remain that way, but we shall see. Rain or no, I will see you all on my walk home before long. Okay, more soon. Hi everyone. Starting at the Joseph-Gabriel tower here, clock tower, to begin my discussion, just having come out of seminar, of today's topic of activism in globalization since 1945. As I'm now becoming used to, we just had a really dynamic and fast-paced conversation on the two books this time, Annette Joseph-Gabriel's Reimagining Liberation and Priyamvada Gopal's Insurgent Empire. So now I wanted to start at the clock tower here, in part because, and the rain waited for me, so, or it waited until I got out here, I should say, but it's not raining too hard, so hopefully it'll be okay. So I wanted to start there at the clock tower because it seemed like a fitting kind of bookend in comparison to where I began with the in my introductory remarks for this week's lecture with the statue of Queen Victoria. So we have one symbol of imperialism at one end of town, and another symbol of imperialism with the Joseph-Gabriel Tower at the other. So and those seem fitting to me because we're thinking about activism this week, and we're thinking about activism in particular in relation to imperialism, or maybe more precisely, we're thinking about anti-colonial activism. Maybe also with Annette Joseph-Gabriel, maybe we're thinking about decolonial activism, which is a little bit different, and we might want to think about this language here as well. So a couple of remarks just generally about activism and writing thereon, or the kind of impact that activism has. The first thing I wanted to say, this is an important question for me because I've written a little bit about this myself in terms of activism and historiography on U.S. empire, and activism and indigenous studies in the North American context, is that point here being that activism has an impact on intellectual production, and activism is itself a form of intellectual production, and we really see that in both of the readings this week. So we want to think about the ways that that social movements have an impact on the kind of knowledge that's generated in the academy. And it's quite fitting that I'm talking about this on this walk because, as you'll see, here I am, of course, walking across campus, right by the library here, past this new teaching and learning building. But in a moment, I'm about to leave campus, of course, on my walk home to head out into the wider community. And you'll notice no great transformation will come over me. In fact, the division between the ivory tower and the wider world is not that much of a division, in fact. And the kinds of structures of power around which contemporary British society is organized, and the way that it is memorialized with positive references to empire, are of course the same structures of power that shape society on campus and off. And campus itself, in this sense, is not separate from, and not apart from, and not aloof from structures of power in society, but is itself an example of them in many ways. There's so many ways in which we could catalog that. How the campus is organized, who has access, who feels more comfortable on campus, who gets paid which wages for which jobs on this campus, etc. So there's that to think about in terms of connections between campus and community. But particularly here, I just want to start by thinking about the idea of the impact of the ideas that are talked about in places like this are learned from and are only, I would go so far as to say, are only possible because of the kinds of activities that take place off campus. And in this case in particular, social movements themselves shape the thinking, shape our thinking about history in a variety of ways. So here, as I step off campus, perfect time to say it, I want to de-emphasize the division between campus and community, and activism, and writing about activism is a really good way of doing that. Okay, so let me start by saying a little bit then. I'll start by saying a little bit about Reimagining Empire, Reimagining Liberation, sorry, by Annette Joseph-Gabriel. I made a couple of notes here with my phone. It's getting wet though. Let's see how it goes. Okay, one of the students in class, by the way, called this a global microhistory, which I thought was a really nice way of putting the kind of way in which this book is able to, operate at the single biographical level, and also putting that in a much wider kind of global scope as well. So the individuals here: Suzanne Césaire, Paulette Nardal, Eugène Eboetel, Jane Vial, André Blouin, Aoué Kaita, and Islanda Robeson are the figures who Joseph-Gabriel focuses on. And so she does this to make a couple, several really important arguments and interventions. So first of all, she wants to connect, and this is in keeping with what I was just saying at a more general level, she wants to connect the activism of these black women around the Francophone and even Anglophone with Robeson, imperial and anti-colonial world to artistic, literary, and intellectual production. And was said in as was said in class, some of the sources here really are helpful for thinking about this. So Joseph-Gabriel uses correspondence, letters, poetry, novels. So there's a variety of kinds of sources that she uses, which again help to break down this division we might have in our minds between what quote-unquote intellectuals do and what quote-unquote activists do. And of course, in all of these examples of the individuals that she looks at, activist intellectual is exactly what to call them. So this is the first sort of key point that she's engaging with and getting us to think about. Okay, I'll go a slightly different way on my walk this time, but it's always dangerous to cross these roads, as you know. Give me a second. Nope. Okay, so the next point, the next key part of her argument, or sort of not just part, but another argument that is made in Reimagining Liberation, is is around the question of citizenship. So these activists and intellectuals were not only, working towards liberation and producing knowledge as they did so, but they were more specifically doing this around the question of citizenship and reimagining it. In that, we might think of decolonization, we might think of anti-colonial activism and decolonization in a sort of simplistic way that conceptualizes the move from being in an empire to being part of a country. So citizenship, moving from being a colonial subject to a citizen of a nation. in that sense, seems like a pretty straightforward move, even if it involves a lot of struggle to get there. Well, what Reimagining Liberation gets us to think about is the ways that these thinkers she looks at were actually imagining and reimagining citizenship as a way of reimagining liberation. And what I mean by this is, in the post-war moment, just after World War II, subjects could be citizens of the French Empire, and so there was an idea here that didn't last, but there was an idea that that citizenship could include France and the colonies. And so this might seem like simply just an extension of the imperial system and not anti-colonial, but in fact, there were ways that some thinkers and activists wanted to put forward inclusion as citizens as a way of reimagining their position within the empire, and at the same time, sort of extending the meaning of what France was at the same time. So this is a kind of complex and quite generative position to think about, which complicates the from colony to empire, from empire to nation kind of story. So this is also the work that this book is doing. Now, here's another key component in terms of this book's, as I said, many contributions. So another is to think about, so again, she's writing about black women, and she's writing about them in the, the crucial years, the 1940s through to the 1960s, the years in which, by and large, formal decolonization does take place. So we might think of this as, okay, well, this book helps us to understand the ways that black women made a contribution to that effort. It does that, but it actually does something more than that. It shows that these were integral to the project of anti-colonialism, which is often imagined as male. And it also shows that it doesn't make sense to just have a sort of separate section of black women's activism as opposed to black men of color, as we're thinking about the decolonial sort of efforts that followed World War II throughout the French Empire in this case. So it's getting us to think about, the book is getting us to think about gender as a, well, to use the kind of apt phrasing, as a useful category of analysis here in terms of thinking about empire, decolonization, and citizenship. What does it what difference does it make in this sense to put gender at the center of the story? In fact, it makes quite a bit of a difference. It can't just be an add-on. By adding gender, it reorients our view to think about what the implications were in terms of gender politics for these big questions about empire, decolonization, citizenship, and nation. Okay, so finally, one of the other arguments I just want to make sure that we've got is that Annette Joseph-Gabriel doesn't shy away from the kind of complex relations that these thinkers and activists had to power, to structures of power, to racial imperial structures of power. And what I mean here is, first of all, and this shouldn't be surprising, that these women didn't speak in one voice from one perspective. They had different, we might say some were more radical, people like Islanda Robeson, we might position as radical, and we might position Suzanne Césaire as perhaps less radical in this sense. She also shows the radical possibilities of all of the thinkers that she looks at, but we also can see moments of complex engagement with struggles of power that don't simply position these women as sort of purely rebels, outside of the system and opposing it in every way, but rather are, maybe a better word is, negotiating it as they seek new forms of freedom against, and sometimes within and against, as we want to think about it. Okay, so let me say a little bit now about reimagining liberation's relationship to historiography, and I just want to cite a couple of streams here of work that kind of connects up to this book that this book builds upon, and that this book really forces us to rethink. So the first one is, this isn't the first book, and in fact it's one of a series of recent important works to think about this question of empire and citizenship. And so Frederick Cooper's Between Empire and Nation is probably the best known of the more recent works that look at this same question. The question being, what does it mean to imagine a kind of freedom in some ways within the imperial structure? And how does that reimagining of freedom necessitate complete reworking of what the metropole is at the same time, right? So if instead of the move from colony to nation, the French Empire reconstituted itself in a more equal way through the idea of imperial citizenship, then maybe something different, maybe something more liberatory would have been the result. It's a kind of possibility. And what works like Cooper's does, and there's another important book by Gary Wilder called Freedom Time, which focuses on the male figures of Léopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire. What these books do is they show the contingency of this history, right? That the empire to nation story wasn't a given one. It wasn't inevitable that nation would follow from empire. And exactly Cooper's first word in his title, between, is a good sort of a good word for thinking about just this. So we can think here about the kinds of different broad conceptions of freedom that went into decolonization. They were not simply about achieving nation-state status for the colonized at the end of World War II. And here, Adam Getaçew's World Making After Empire is another book that we'd want to think about in this connection. It's less directly focused on citizenship, as these other two books I just mentioned are, which are about the French Empire. So World Making After Empire looks more at the Anglophone anti-colonial world, but also this world-making idea, again, suggests and really shows how the visions of liberation that anti-colonial thinkers were bringing forward kind of across the 20th century, but particularly from the interwar years through to the 1970s in the case of Getaçew's work, that this was a project of world making. This wasn't a project of reform within the world as it was. It was going to remake the global structure of racial capitalism. And so to achieve decolonization in this wider kind of framework of world making would be to undo the system of racial capitalism that has, developed over the course of centuries. And so in her case, other actors, she's looking at people like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and others, that this also, that they're what they were trying to achieve as activists, among other things, was not simply to get hold of the reins of power of new states, but was to actually unmake and remake the world, as it were. So we can think about then Joseph-Gabriel's book in connection to this as, more in keeping maybe with the kind of lessons of the last book that I said, but also of, again, two things: putting gender at the center of the analysis, which is not at the center of the analysis in Cooper and Wilder's books. And by moving gender to the center, we also move Paris out of the center in that sense. That is, if you, as you will notice in Reimagining Liberation, we have, again, global microhistory is an interesting term for this. It's at the biographical level of each of these individuals, but it ranges across the African continent, across the Atlantic to the Caribbean as well. So this makes for a less Paris-centric kind of, Paris-centric analysis here. Which connects up to one more thing about Paris, though, that I do want to say, which is, and this was a book that was mentioned rightly in our conversation in seminar, was Michael Gopal's Anti-Imperial Metropolis, which is a book about migrant activist intellectuals in Paris in the years between World War I and World War II. And Gopal's book speaks also directly to this question of citizenship, but he takes a different tack. For him, this idea of, that the nation may not have been the goal is an interesting one to think about, but it also is the case that nationalism had a very strong pull for the political activists that he's writing about, and it did for many. So I should just put this forward, that it's not simply the case that, Frederick Cooper in particular, his very influential book, that its thesis is simply accepted. It's really, worth putting into conversation with Michael Gopal's anti-imperialist anti-imperial metropolis in this sense. And then, in addition, to then bring in Annette Joseph-Gabriel's, analysis of gender and reimagining from the perspective of Black women outside of Paris, often, to think about how that entire sort of debate can be recast in light of this book. So this is, I think, really important for us to grapple with. A book that connects up to a multiplicity of historiographical streams, while also, not just simply adding to them, but causing us to kind of rethink entire debates at the same time. Now, another stream that Reimagining Liberation also connects to is that of another, kind of set of historiography around Black women's activism in mid-century. And so this is an exciting and growing, I guess we could call it a field, or maybe a kind of emergence over a range of fields, really. So here, again, we're looking at the Francophone imperial world, but there are some really important books from the US context and elsewhere on this topic. So I'd mention a couple of them if people are interested in following this up. So Eric McDuffie's Sojourning for Freedom is one that comes readily to mind. And this book is about the, as he calls it, the kind of formation of Black left feminism within the United States, very much in an international context. And so he looks at people like Esther Cooper Jackson, whose life and contributions I recommend everyone simply sort of, if you don't know who Esther Cooper Jackson is, stop what you're doing and look her up, because her life is really fascinating. So she is an activist over many decades, from before World War II ongoing. As far as I know, Esther Cooper Jackson is still alive, and her contributions to liberation within the United States and to the Black freedom movement have been many, varied, and of long standing. In any case, she's a good example of one of the figures that features in Eric McDuffie's important book. Deo Gore's Radicalism at the Crossroads comes out in 2011. Same year, actually. 2011 is a big year for this topic, because McDuffie's book, Deo Gore's Radicalism at the Crossroads, which also looks at Black women's activism across, the mid-20th century, but a bit longer, and also with an international perspective. People like Vicky Garvin, who are activists in the US, relocate to Ghana, spend time in the People's Republic of China, spend significant time in the People's Republic of China, are some of the people that is an example of someone in this book. And so again, these books, also in 2011, Cheryl Higashita's Black Internationalist Feminism is a little bit like Reimagining Liberation, more of a focuses more on the literary sort of qualities of the writers. Again, this is someone from literature background, so that makes sense in Higashita's case, as it does with Joseph-Gabriel. So we have a kind of work there that catalogs black internationalist feminist thinking in the U.S. again across many of the same decades, with a literary kind of focus. With people like, to pick an example there, someone like the playwright Lorraine Hansberry, for example, is someone who figures in that book. So, point here being that we can see reimagining liberation in a historiographical landscape in which there is a kind of emerging but also ongoing and growing discussion specifically about black women's activist and intellectual contributions. I'll add an even more recent book here which moves us to a different geographical space, and that's Tiffany Florville's Mobilizing Black Germany, which I just started it, I'm reading it at the moment, and it's also, it's brilliant and definitely compels our attention in terms of thinking about Germany, a country that we may imagine as white, and thinking about what Afro-German, particularly women's, organizing looks like there. With a figure, again, with numerous figures, Maya Yim being one of the prominent examples there. Another activist, poet, intellectual, influenced by Audre Lorde, who spent time in West Germany in the 1980s and into the early 1990s. And so here, this activism in Germany, you know, like with the other examples that I'm talking about, really reimagines, makes, you know, completely different ways of thinking about the space in which they're taking place. So a book like Mobilizing Black Germany shows how these activists rethink and force white Germans to begin to rethink perhaps their nation as well. Okay, here's this extra dangerous crossing. Look at this. I don't know how. You're just supposed to run across, I think. Okay, here I go. Let's see. So maybe on my walks home, I'll connect this junction to our topic. I did last time by talking about Cold War individualism. Here, obviously, and actually, you could think about that junction in terms of if that junction was to become a place where people could cross the road safely, instead of just being somewhere where cars could drive quickly, then maybe some activism would be necessary in order to bring that change about, which clearly the city is not going to do on its own. At the same time, such an endeavor would compel a rethinking, would also be a kind of conceptual contribution to what a city means, who should have access, and other things. Now, of course, I say this as a university professor with a middle-class job. It's not really about me, but more who such a space excludes, namely people who couldn't afford cars, but also people who don't have cars for a variety of other reasons. So there's an everyday example, and in my case, really every day, I have to cross that junction each day, twice, of thinking about how activism, if there was such a thing to emerge around this space, is connected to intellectual production, and is itself a kind of theory. Okay, but I digress, as I often do when I cross that road, so forgive me. Okay, now, so I just wanted to note then that again, that reimagining liberation also connects to this important work specifically on black women's liberation. Keisha Blaine's Set the World on Fire, which looks at black nationalist women within the US in an international context, is a really important additional work that we could think about in this regard as well. Okay, so now, you know, I have this other really busy junction to cross. I'm going to catch my breath and turn the camera off for a second, and I'll switch to talking about our other book once I get across this road. Just let me do this first. Okay, one moment. Okay, hi everyone, back again. I made it. So let me switch now to talking about Gopal's Insurgent Empire, which I feel like maybe more students in the group read this week, and that's not too surprising given the connection to Britain directly with that book, and also the kind of public discussions that it's been part of, and that its author, Priyamvada Gopal, has been, you know, as people were mentioning in class, people really have learned a lot from her on Twitter as much as they're learning about her in her kind of more formal academic work here. So, you know, in terms of the argument, I think we want to think here in a parallel way, actually, to Ned Richardson Little's Human Rights Dictatorship, which we read last week, in the following way. What Gopal does is she begins with the dominant narrative, just like as you'll remember was the case in Human Rights Dictatorship, and then shows what's lacking, inadequate, and in fact wrong about that dominant narrative, as well as the kinds of ideological work that dominant narrative performs in relation to unequal power relations. Okay, so in this case, what is the dominant narrative? The dominant narrative is that, well, one version is that the British Empire was benign, first of all, but also that the British Empire was benevolent. So maybe the British Empire, you know, a criticism might be, well, it wasn't entirely benign, but it was benevolent in that upon recognizing, you know, some of the unfortunate, what might we say, oppressions that were part of it, racial slavery, for instance, that with its wisdom and good judgment, the British Empire ended the slave trade in 1807, bestowed independence upon colonial societies when they were ready for it, and so on. This sort of idea that, I mean, obviously, you know, this paternalist narrative is simply racist, of course, in the ways that it you know, imagines that racial slavery wasn't abhorrent from its origin, or that it might imagine that that colonized peoples would be at any point not ready to not be you know, under the rule of the British Empire, etc. Okay, so this is one of the points, right? So and this is key, that rather than a bestowal of sort of ideas of liberty from Britain, in fact, what you have is, I think she calls it hard-fought struggle, indeed, correctly. That decolonization and emancipation from slavery were struggles. They involved hard-fought struggle from the oppressed to win those victories against those systems. So that is a key part of her argument. But in some ways, and this is building her argument here, we already know that. Because there have been important studies that her work, you know, very, how would I say, like in a way that she very much admits and acknowledges, is building upon the works of other earlier scholars who have made a similar kind of point about the agency of the oppressed. So we might think here of, you know, an early work like C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. So James's book is from 1938, Du Bois's from 1935. Two examples of a number that we could point to that make a similar kind of argument. Okay, so we might see Insurgent Empire then as contributing to and filling out this picture across a pretty long stretch of time, the 1850s to the 1950s, roughly, across basically a century, and across a pretty broad geographical scope as well, as we see, bringing in the African continent, the Asian subcontinent, the Caribbean. So there's quite a bit going on. But what I want to say is that this book is not simply, it does contribute to that perspective, and it definitely arrives within that tradition, but it also does something more than that. So it shows how the the kinds of liberation projects that were pursued in enslaved and colonial spaces by enslaved and colonized peoples really shaped ideas in the center, at the metropole. So we could think of this in kind of conversation with Annette Joseph-Gabriel's book, in that her book sort of decenters Paris. This book doesn't decenter the metropole exactly, but gets us to think about it in a new way. This really generative concept of reverse tutelage, right? In which, no, it's not the case that the empire bestowed liberty upon the colonized, but rather through hard-fought struggle, the colonized taught the center something about freedom. Is essentially what she's doing. And so this isn't a story of benevolence. It's a story about solidarity. It's a story about how people in the UK were able to think anew and to think more deeply about questions of liberation, of freedom, about how to organize societies. And they learned this from the struggles that they were watching and becoming aware of across the colonial world. So a good example of this is the Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, arriving at a very important year. This uprising in the Caribbean, challenges the power of colonialism, at the same time as the U.S. Civil War in terms of slavery here. She talks less about this, but obviously this is significantly happening simultaneously. Is that the U.S. Civil War and the enormous hard-fought struggle that entails, led by African Americans opposing slavery, is part of this sort of epic moment of rebellion. Okay, but Morant Bay, or the uprising, the sometimes called quote-unquote mutiny in India in 1857, is another example. And she walks through from the mid 19th century. She walks through these different examples, these different exchanges, through to something like the International African Service Bureau in the 1930s and 40s, as another sort of example of this. The difference this time being that more individuals, again, more activist intellectuals from the colonized world, have arrived in the metropole at this point and are also shaping and influencing this conversation very directly. Okay, so a couple more points about this. One is, in terms of sources, Gopal doesn't claim to have unearthed, new documents per se, though some of them have been overlooked. That's not the project. It's not an empiricist sort of methodological program in that sense. Rather, and I think this is really important for us to think about for our own research as postgraduate students, as well as me as someone who works as a historian, in the role of interpretation of documents. There's sometimes a way that we think about what historians do is we find things in archives. We do that, but we also, and I would say much more significantly, we interpret documents that we either find or that we look at because someone else found them and we want to have a look at them too. Interpretation is key. And so in Insurgent Empire, we have an interpretation, maybe we might say a reinterpretation of a number of texts, reports, from these various rebellions and various freedom struggles that unfold across the British Empire, across the century that she looks at. Okay, so what does this do? This makes us rethink what the UK is, right? And it makes us think about how, as she, so rightly and so insightfully argues, that this shows us how the UK is a product of empire. This is true, and we're coming to see this in new ways. That's not just a simple given as well, but also very important and in some ways an original contribution here, that the UK is also the product of anti-colonial history. Ideas of freedom in 21st century Britain are shaped by the ideas that have been taught to Britain from aggrieved actors fighting for their freedom in different ways. So we also see here a connection to the issue of how activism is itself intellectual production here as well, very central to the argument here. Okay, so now let me just speak very briefly. In fact, I almost had a chance to cross the street. I thought I'm almost home, but I want to say a couple more words, so maybe I'll cross the street and just walk through this park across the street for a quick minute, if I can cross. Well, let me just start quickly because this shouldn't take too long. Okay, so the three streams that I want to talk about here are postcolonial studies, the historiography concerning the idea of the empire at home, and the historiography that's looking at the relationship between fascism and colonialism. I want to say something, I want to get across this street in one piece, and then I want to say something about those if I can. So in terms of the first point, postcolonial studies. So very quickly here, and we talked about this a bit in class about how, postcolonial studies is sometimes notorious for, what we might call difficult to read sort of texts, right? Homi Bhabha and Gayatri Spivak's work are not breezy reads, right? So, and so we had a conversation in class about the extent to which this book departs from, or maybe is a continuation of that kind of mode of academic and scholarly expression. Okay, but let's put that point aside for a minute to say more in keeping with her argument that one of the issues in postcolonial studies that Gopal identifies is a kind of concentration and focus on metropolitan imperial discourse. And of course that does a certain kind of work, and that's important to understand, but she wants to look at how rebellion is overlooked in that sense. And so she singles out Lisa Lowe's intimacies of Four Continents a little bit, to my mind, a little bit unfairly there. But you can make of that what you will. This is because simply because Lisa Lowe's book is so brilliant and should be looked at as well. Gopal would agree with that, I'm sure. But the point here is that the larger point of Insurgent Empire vis-a-vis postcolonial studies is that there hasn't been enough attention to bottom-up struggle, essentially, and its influence on ideas in the metropole. Okay, so that's stream one. Stream two, the empire at home. And for those who are new to this historiography, I would recommend Catherine Hall and Sonia Rose's At Home with the Empire, a book that it's a collection of essays, and it's kind of a culmination in some ways of this insight across a range of topics. So the idea being, again, that imperialism isn't simply something that happened out there in the colonies, but of course very much shaped the unfolding of history within the UK as well. And third and finally, and I feel like this is such an exciting area of historiography, is the work that's looking at the connections between, or the ways of thinking together of, perhaps we might say, fascism and imperialism. So if you think in a very simple way about World War II, Britain, the empire, is against Germany, the fascist power, right? These are not, they're not the same. And there also is a way of thinking about this is kind of long and complicated, I'll oversimplify, that anti-fascist alliance is about sort of downplaying anti-imperialism. And the reason for this is because in the moment of the 1930s, when fascism was such a crisis, obviously, and the horrible places that it went, that this wasn't the moment for criticizing imperialists. This was the moment for ultimately during World War II, someone like Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill to be on the same side. So what gets lost in that is a way of thinking about the, we might say, family relationship between fascism and imperialism as kind of, colonizing expansionist kinds of projects. So in terms of the historiography, there's work on this within the German context. There's work on thinking about fascism and thinking about fascism as colonialism. So a book like Shelley Baranowski's Nazi Empire is an example of this. I mean, it also connects the earlier German colonial history, the Kaiserreich period from the 1870s through to World War I, as in some, as in important ways connected to the Nazi expansionism of the 1930s and 40s. So there's stuff going on in German historiography that thinks about this. Wendy Lower's book, Hitler's Furies, is a good example of this, that again puts gender at the center, thinking about the role of women not simply within Nazi Germany, but thinking about the role of women within the empire building kind of project that Nazism in some ways was in the East, right, in Poland and in the Soviet Union. So Gopal's book connects to that stream of thinking, but it also connects to other related streams of historiography that are looking at, and Insurgent Empire does this, looking at anti-colonial and anti-racist thought as itself already having done some of that work of thinking about fascism and colonialism in one frame. Leslie James's book on George Padmore and Decolonisation from Below is another great example of a book that does this. And finally, I'll finish with this. This was a recent essay from a few months ago in the Boston Review by the political theorist Alberto Toscano, which looks at the question of fascism in the United States, which we know is a really live topic right now, and makes the important point that rather than think about fascism in the US or incipient or potential fascism through analogy to Nazi Germany, why not think with those thinkers like George Padmore, Angela Davis, and others, W.E.B. Du Bois, who thought about fascism as a kind of already existing reality for people of color in places like the United States and in the colonies as well. So there's a third and also key stream of historiography that Insurgent Empire connects to. Okay, time for me to go home, and just let me conclude by just saying, great conversation in class, great conversation on the discussion boards with the distance learning students as well, and obviously a topic as important as activism gives us a lot to think about and talk about. So with that, I'll see you next time. Bye.